Americans understand that some people will earn more money than others, and we don't resent those who, by virtue of their efforts, achieve incredible success. That's what America's all about. But Americans overwhelmingly agree that no one who works full-time should ever have to raise a family in poverty. In the years since I asked this Congress to raise the minimum wage, 5 states have passed laws to raise theirs. Many businesses have done it on their own.
This is Channels Television's Breaking News.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Colin Corrigan, and I'm here with CEWL News, the real news network. While other stations may try to dance around the truth, we here at CEWL bring you the facts, the cold, hard facts. Today's topic we'll be talking about will be minimum wage, an issue that's dated back to when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was in office. In current news, President Trump today crossed party lines when he said that the minimum wage should be raised. We go now live to what he was saying.
The minimum wage has to go up. People are at least $10, but it has to go up. But I think that states, I think that states should really call the shot. As an example, I live in New York. It's very expensive in New York. You can't buy a hot dog for the money you're talking about. You go to other states and it's not expensive at all. Now, what it does is puts New York at a disadvantage if the minimum wage is like companies move out and things, bad things happen. At the same time, people have to be taken care of. But what I'm really going to do on the minimum wage, but it has to go up. Now, Bernie Sanders lied. Bernie Sanders said in his speech the other day that Donald Trump wants the minimum wage to go below $7. I said, where did he come up with that one? That one is just like Joe Biden lied today. He said that Donald Trump wants to carpet bomb. He was on television. He said Donald Trump wants to carpet bomb the enemy in the Middle East. Now, that was Ted Cruz that said that. That was not Donald Trump. I mean, he's not a very bright guy, but that was Ted Cruz that said it.
Minimum wage has been up for debate for many years, with both sides of the argument making sure that their voices are heard. Today, for you, our viewers, we're going to debate: should minimum wage and living wages in America be eliminated? We're going to help you decide that. But first, we have to take a look at how they're implemented, why they're implemented, and the overall purpose of the minimum wage in America.
A minimum wage is the lowest amount of currency that employers can legally pay their workers. Equivalently, it is the price floor below which workers may not sell their labor. Minimum wage was first instituted by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1938 at 25 cents an hour, an amount equivalent to about $4 today. Since then, it has been raised 22 times by 12 different presidents. The purpose of minimum wage in 1938 was to stabilize the post-Depression economy and protect the workers in the labor force. The minimum wage was designed to create a minimum standard of living to protect the health and well-being of all employees.
Today, the federal minimum wage is $7.25 after it was raised in 2009 by President Barack Obama. 28 states and the District of Columbia have set a minimum wage above the federal minimum wage, and 13 states and the District of Columbia have a minimum wage above $10. Arguments today that justify minimum wage mostly hang on the idea that firms have a responsibility to ensure that their workers earn enough to live on. If a firm can't pay its workers enough to live on, then it isn't a viable business because it is dependent on wage subsidy.
Advocates for abolishing the minimum wage argue a federal minimum wage doesn't make sense, considering the cost of living differs between areas of the country. They argue that an increase in the minimum wage would actually hurt low-skilled workers because businesses would reduce their hours to cope with the added costs, and some companies may even automate low-skilled jobs. They also argue an increase in the minimum wage would hurt small businesses who can't afford reduced profits.
As I've said, today we'll be debating whether or not to abolish or keep minimum wage. To argue in favor of the abolishment of minimum wage, we have Will Rackmeyer and Luke DiGiacobi. And to argue in favor of the minimum wage, we have Evan Lotz. Will, let's start with you. Why do you think we should get rid of a wage law that's been around for nearly a century?
There's a couple of reasons I believe that the minimum wage should be abolished.
but the main reasons are due to differing costs of living across the country and that the increasing minimum wage will negatively impact low-skilled workers.
All right, Will, thanks for that insight. We now go to Evan Lotz for his thoughts on the matter.
Well, Colin, it's quite evident to me why we need to keep a minimum wage around. Without a minimum wage, firms and large corporations are going to abuse their power and pay these labor workers nothing. This can be to the point where they can't move up anywhere economically, and they're going to be stuck below the poverty line. We've seen this occur countless times in other countries, and I don't plan on the USA becoming like these other nations anytime soon.
Good points all around, gentlemen, but now it's time to really get into it. Luke, what do you have to say about Evan's point about countries that don't have minimum wage and how these countries perform economically?
Contrary to Evan's beliefs, countries without a minimum wage perform well economically and have low unemployment rates. Switzerland, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Austria, and Italy all have no minimum wage, and their unemployment rates are about 4 percentage points lower than their neighboring European countries that have minimum wage. Switzerland has an unemployment rate of 3.2%. Denmark and Austria both have unemployment rates below 5%, and Sweden has an unemployment rate of about 6.2%, all of which are below the average unemployment rate of European countries at 8.3%.
Very interesting, Luke. Evan, how would you respond?
Yes, that is true, but most of these countries are socialist states where the salaries are already regulated and set by the governments. This is America. We're a free market economy. Let's be much more realistic here. Let's take a look at free market countries with minuscule or no minimum wage. Let's take a look at Mexico, one of our biggest trading partners, for example. The Mexican government has had an extremely low minimum wage, and because of it, they've had to raise their minimum wage multiple times. Since they have raised their minimum wage to 80 pesos, which is roughly about $4 US, the poverty levels have declined tremendously. And yet still, Mexico has about 53.4 million people out of the 122 million people living in the country living in poor states. If Mexico had no minimum wage or a lower minimum wage like they had previously, these families would have zero purchasing power at all, and they would be living in completely impoverished conditions.
Good points all around, gentlemen. On to our next question for Will. Why does the minimum wage not make sense?
The minimum wage, specifically the federal minimum wage, does not make sense because the cost of living differs around the country. Different areas have different markets, resources, and populations, so residents in high-cost areas are unable to survive on the $7.25 federal minimum wage and would be better off if the minimum wage were to be abolished and negotiated their wages with their employers.
Evan, how would you respond?
Well, you might be right in some areas, but I'm actually going to have to agree with President Trump on this one. If we move towards a state minimum wage, we're going to be able to adjust to the cost of living in each state much better. State governments are better able to analyze their economic states, poverty levels, cost of living, and real estate prices. Obviously, the minimum wage in North Dakota and New York should be tremendously different. We can't have firms abuse their power and offer a $7 wage in New York City when you can't even get a meal for that cheap. With a solid and appropriate minimum wage in each state, we're going to be able to shrink poverty levels so families can live in a much better condition.
Now to our last question for you, Evan. What will we see if the minimum wage is raised?
Quite honestly, Colin, I love the idea of raising the minimum wage. Let's say we raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. That would inject roughly $450 billion into the economy each year. That would give purchasing power to millions of poor and lower middle class Americans. This would stimulate buying, production, and hiring. In fact, studies by the EPI Institute show that $15 minimum wage would directly affect 51 million workers and indirectly benefit an additional 30 million. That's 81 million people, or about 64% of the labor force. Their families would be able to buy more cars, clothing, and food from all of our nation's businesses. This would stimulate much more economic growth. And no one earning the current minimum wage of about $15,000 a year can even aspire to live decently, much less raise a family. As a result, almost all workers living on this minimum wage need a plethora of taxpayer-supported benefits, including Medicaid, earned income tax credit, food stamps, and housing subsidies.
Great argument, Evan. Now to the other side with Will and Luke. What do you guys think we'd see if the minimum wage would be raised, and what do you think would happen if the minimum wage would be abolished?
Well, here's the thing, Colin. An increased minimum wage will cause businesses' profits to be cut, which leads to a few problems. First off, businesses that are not willing to pay the minimum wage will decide to have less employees, which will then cause higher unemployment. A recent study from economics at the University of California, Irvine, and London School of Economics found their higher minimum wages cause employees to automate low-wage jobs. This will reduce the amount of jobs available for teenage and low-skilled workers. Increasing the minimum wage will also cause big corporations to be even more dominant. Small businesses who are already struggling to compete with these bigger corporations will see their profits reduced significantly and have to lay off employees in order to survive. Amazon recently raised their wages for all employees to $15 per hour, but this wasn't out of the goodness of their heart. Rather, it was because they can afford to raise these wages, and they know that the smaller businesses cannot afford to.
If the minimum wage were to be abolished completely, the market would be able to work itself out as different types of labor would receive different wages depending on difficulty, skill level required, and other factors. We would also see labor unions become more popular as workers would become responsible for negotiating their wages rather than having to rely on politicians. In 2017, only 10.7% of workers belonged to a labor union, and this is the lowest percentage since labor membership data became available in 1983. For comparison, in 1983, 20.1% of workers belonged to a labor union, and in the 1950s, more than a third of workers belonged to a union. In conclusion, more difficult jobs would then receive the higher wages that they deserve, and we would see an increasing labor membership.
Well, gentlemen, you've certainly made some great points today, and you've showcased your knowledge on this issue, for sure. On that note, we conclude our debate on the minimum wage. We've provided you the facts, and now it's up to you, Malvern Prep, to decide your stance on the issue. For all of us here at CEWL News Network, I'm Colin Corrigan. You stay classy, Malvern Prep.
This is Channels Television's breaking news.